In 1999, the world was introduced to a name that would forever change the conversation about children and crime: Lionel Tate. He was only 12 years old when he did something so unthinkable that it sent shockwaves across the nation. It all began in a quiet neighborhood in Broward County, Florida. Lionel was home with his mother's friend's daughter, 6-year-old Tiffany Unick. The two were left unsupervised while Lionel's mother went upstairs to rest. Hours later, Tiffany was dead. When authorities arrived, Lionel told them it was an accident. He said they had been wrestling, imitating moves they'd seen on television. He never meant to hurt her, but when the medical examiner released the autopsy report, the story took a horrifying turn. Tiffany's body showed a fractured skull, broken ribs, and a lacerated liver. The injuries were so severe that doctors said they were consistent with a fall from a 3-story building or a violent, sustained beating. The public was stunned. How could a 12-year-old inflict that kind of damage? And more importantly, what would drive a child to do it? Investigators struggled to understand Lionel's mindset. He didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what had happened. Some experts believed he lacked empathy. Others thought he was simply too young to understand death itself. But prosecutors saw things differently. To them, this wasn't child's play gone wrong. It was murder. The state of Florida decided to try Lionel Tate as an adult, charging him with first-degree murder. If convicted, he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision sparked outrage and debate. Critics argued that a 12-year-old's brain isn't fully developed, that he couldn't form the intent required for such a serious charge. Supporters of the prosecution said that no matter his age, Tiffany was gone, and someone had to be held accountable. Soon, the case of the 12-year-old killer became a national obsession. Talk shows, newspapers, and radio stations couldn't stop talking about the boy who was too young to drive, too young to vote, but old enough to face life behind bars. The courtroom in Broward County was silent. Cameras flashed, reporters filled every seat, and in the center of it all sat a 14-year-old boy in an oversized suit, Lionel Tate. He was barely tall enough to see over the defense table, but the charges against him were as serious as they come: first-degree murder. The state of Florida had made its decision. They would try him as an adult. For many watching, it felt wrong. A child facing a sentence meant for the worst adult criminals? But for others, especially Tiffany Unick's grieving family, justice demanded nothing less. The prosecution didn't waste time. They told the jury that Tiffany's injuries were not the result of a game. The medical examiner testified that her skull had been fractured, her ribs broken, her liver torn. The force, they said, could not have come from playful wrestling. It had to be intentional. Their argument was simple. Even if Lionel was a child, he knew what pain was and he kept going. To them, that made him guilty of murder. But Lionel's defense team painted a different picture. They described a boy obsessed with professional wrestling, a child lost in fantasy, mimicking moves he didn't understand. He was only 12 at the time, they reminded the jury. He couldn't truly grasp what death meant, nor comprehend the magnitude of his actions. His lawyer pleaded with the court. He's a child who made a tragic mistake. He's not a monster. Yet, as the trial continued, public opinion was divided. Some saw Lionel as a dangerous youth who needed to be locked away. Others saw a broken system punishing a child instead of helping him. In January 2001, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that stunned the courtroom: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was automatic: life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the words were read, Lionel began to cry. His mother sobbed as deputies led him away. Across the room, Tiffany's family wept too, not with relief, but with sorrow. 2 children's lives had been destroyed, and nothing could bring Tiffany back. Outside the courthouse, the nation reacted with disbelief. How could a 12-year-old be condemned to spend his entire life behind bars? Civil rights groups called it cruel and unusual punishment. Psychologists warned that the system was treating a child like an adult without understanding how differently they think and feel. But for now, it was over. Lionel Tate, at just 14, became the youngest person in modern American history sentenced to life in prison. Don't forget to like, comment, comment and subscribe, hit the notification bell. When the news broke that a 12-year-old boy had been sentenced to life in prison without parole, America couldn't look away. The verdict in Lionel Tate's case divided the country, and soon it divided the world. For some, justice had been served. A child had taken a life and there had to be consequences. But for many others, the idea of locking away a child forever felt inhumane, cruel, and deeply wrong. Legal experts, psychologists, and human rights advocates began to speak out. They pointed to decades of research showing that children's brains are still developing, especially the parts that control impulse and judgment. Kids act before they think. They mimic what they see. They don't always grasp the permanence of death or the consequences of violence. To punish a child as if he were an adult, they argued, was to ignore science and to strip away any hope for rehabilitation. Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch condemned the sentence, calling it a violation of basic human rights. The United Nations even criticized the United States, pointing out that no other developed country sentenced children to die in prison. Even Pope John Paul II expressed concern over the case, urging compassion for Lionel and reconsideration of the punishment. Meanwhile, Lionel sat behind bars, alone, scared, and confused. He was housed with older inmates, many of whom had committed violent crimes. The boy who once played video games and watched wrestling now lived in a world of concrete walls, cold food, and constant fear. But outside, his story had become a symbol. People began protesting and writing to Florida's governor. National television shows featured debates about whether America's justice system had gone too far. Was Lionel a murderer or a victim of circumstance? His legal team filed appeals, arguing that he was not mentally competent to stand trial as an adult. They said Lionel had not understood the charges against him or the meaning of a life sentence. After years of legal battles, in 2004, the Florida Court of Appeals overturned Lionel Tate's conviction. The judges agreed that the boy hadn't been given a fair trial. His guilty plea was thrown out, and after nearly 3 years in prison, Lionel was released, under strict probation and mandatory counseling. When he walked out of prison, he was 16 years old. Cameras surrounded him, reporters shouted questions, and America watched as the boy who had once been called a monster took his first steps toward freedom. When Lionel Tate walked out of prison in 2004, he was 16 years old, a teenager who had already spent years behind bars. The cameras followed him, flashing like lightning as he stepped into the sunlight. To many, it looked like a moment of hope, a second chance for a boy who had lost his childhood behind concrete walls. Lionel smiled shyly at reporters. "I just want to move on with my life," he said. But rebuilding a life after being branded the youngest American sentenced to life in prison was never going to be easy. He tried to start fresh. He went back to school, spoke about wanting to become a youth counselor, and lived under strict probation. He wasn't allowed to own weapons, break curfew, or even leave the county without permission. His every move was watched. First, things seemed to be improving, but the shadows of his past never left. He struggled to adjust to freedom, to the noise, the attention, and the pressure of being the boy everyone talked about. His name was no longer just a story, it was a label. Then, in 2005, barely a year after his release, Lionel was arrested again. This time, it was for violating probation after being accused of carrying a knife to a pizza restaurant. The incident reignited old debates. Some said he was being unfairly targeted. Others believed he was proving the courts right all along. He was released again, but his behavior only grew more erratic. The system had freed him, but it hadn't healed him. In 2006, things took a darker turn. Police say Lionel robbed a pizza delivery man at gunpoint, stealing 4 pizzas and $33 in cash. The boy who had once pleaded for mercy was now accused of committing an armed robbery. When officers confronted him, they found a gun in his possession. For prosecutors, this was the breaking point. Lionel had violated his probation again, and this time there would be no second chances. In 2006, Lionel Tate was sentenced to 30 years in prison for violating probation and armed robbery. The headlines were brutal: Lionel Tate back behind bars. To the public, it felt like a tragic full circle. The system had given him freedom, but he didn't know what to do with it. Behind bars once again, Lionel's story became a cautionary tale. Not just about crime, but about what happens when children are punished before they ever learn how to live. More than 2 decades have passed since the tragedy that forever changed the lives of 2 children, Tiffany Unick and Lionel Tate. What began as a shocking crime in a Florida living room became one of the most debated legal and moral questions in American history. Lionel Tate's case forced the world to confront something deeply uncomfortable. How should society deal with children who kill? After his final conviction in 2006, Lionel faded from headlines, but his story didn't disappear. It lived on in courtrooms, classrooms, and conversations about juvenile justice reform. His name became a symbol, not of evil, but of a system that didn't know what to do with a child who committed an adult crime. In the years that followed, the U.S. Supreme Court made several groundbreaking decisions that changed how America punishes young offenders. In Roper v. Simmons, 2005, the court ruled it unconstitutional to execute minors. In Graham v. Florida, 2010, it banned life sentences without parole for non-homicide offenses committed by juveniles. And in Miller v. Alabama, 2012, it declared mandatory life without parole for minors unconstitutional, requiring judges to consider a child's age, background, and potential for rehabilitation. These rulings were shaped, in part, by cases like Lionel's, by the questions his story forced people to ask. If a child can't vote, drink, or drive, should they really be condemned to die in prison? Today, Lionel remains behind bars, serving his 30-year sentence. He'll be eligible for release in the 2030s, when he's in his 40s. A man who spent nearly his entire life under the weight of a single tragic decision. Some still believe justice was served. Tiffany Unick's family lost a child, and nothing can change that. Others see Lionel as another victim, a boy failed by adults, media, and a justice system more focused on punishment than understanding. His story is a painful reminder that childhood and innocence are not the same thing. That violence, even when committed by the young, leaves scars that time can't erase. And that society must find a balance between justice and mercy, between protecting the public and believing in the power of redemption.